Good afternoon, Smithsonian colleagues, and welcome to the Staff Learning Series hosted by the National Museum of American History. The series aims to explore the trends, topics, and research that relate to the public so that we may better understand our current and future audiences. My name is Adam Razan, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's talk with Charlene Polite Corley, the VP of Diverse Insights and Partnerships at Nielsen. Charlene is a member of Nielsen's uh, um, team for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and Charlene's research and thought leadership are used to amplify the power and influence of Black audiences, showcase media trends among historically excluded communities, and support both the moral and business case that representation matters. Recently named to Diversity Women's Media Power 100 list, Charlene has presented insights and audience trends at Essence Festival, AdWeek, South by Southwest, in her current role, Charlene also collaborates with media industry and advocacy organizations to provide insights in diverse communities and consult on more inclusive content and brand practices based on her research. She joined Nielsen in 2009 after graduating from Florida A&M University for BS and MBA. Outside of Nielsen, Charlene is a creative mentor, event host and speaker, a wife and mom of two. Please note that this discussion is being recorded with closed captioning, and I'll be helping our speaker today by moderating the chat. So please do add your questions there. And lastly, I'd like to hear from you. Please take a moment today or tomorrow and share your thoughts with me on the series. And I would love to hear your ideas for the future. So please reach out. With that said, thank you, Charlene. And please join me in welcoming her to the Staff Learning Series stage. We're honored to have you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Hi, everybody. It's such a privilege to be joining you today as a museum nerd and a big fan of the work across all the Smithsonian establishments. So we will dive right into it. As Adam teed up, we have a series of research that we put out using all of Nielsen's capabilities of an audience measurement called our Diverse Intelligence Series. And our latest report around Black audience trends is the Global Black Audience Shaping the Future of Media. Some of the key trends that we will talk about today are important things that we think our industry across media needs to watch. Number one, that the Black audience really does set the bar for media engagement, that there are some pretty powerful globalization, population immigration trends that folks should watch out for as Black America continues to diversify, but also how this powerful audience is redefining representation and relevance to really tap into all the new layers of intersectionality and nuance that they want to see in their content and in their advertising campaigns. So let's just get started. Number one, important to note is Black America is growing. Our population, our media engagement, and our demand for representation. Today's census estimates we're about 15% of the US population, and that's projected to get to about 18% over the next couple of decades. Key to that growth will be the driver of Black folks who are born outside of the US. And so immigration is going to play a key part in how Black America continues to grow. And we think that that complexity presents a unique challenge and opportunity for the media industry. One, because there's already a ton of complexity that's here. African Americans have been here for quite some time, and there's still things that get wrong in the media. And so that's only going to get harder as you talk about, especially immigration from Africa, bringing the dozens of countries and dialects and languages and cultures. So Black America is really a monolith that we felt strongly about trying to put some data to break down. In addition to the sheer size of the population, the buying power of Black America continues to rise. We know there are still some longstanding disparities when it comes to income equality and economics, but the buying power of Black America is projected to be $2 trillion just in the next couple of years. So again, I mentioned that there's already a ton of complexity that exists today, and media has a tendency to paint in broad strokes, right? So if we look ahead to that 18% and how the population is going to change very quickly, it was also important for us to call out in this report the folks that are already here today adding to that complexity. And so it was important to tease out some perspectives that don't always get talked about when we talk about the Black community. That's the African American experience. I've been here for generations, descendant from America's slavery, enslaved ancestors, or I have my parents were born somewhere else and I'm a first generation American, or I was born outside the US myself. And so we asked questions in our study in such a way to make sure that we could pull in some of those different perspectives and just start to lay out some of the nuance. So again, we focused a lot on representation and the demand that folks want to see more of their identity group represented when they're watching TV or consuming media. And you'll see the difference in those profiles and how they show up. And again, that 16% of the Black American population will be born outside the US by the year 2026. And so that is important for us to, by the year 2060, sorry for that typo, but we think it's important to continue to address the complexity that already exists as we prepare for this global influx that will add even more intersectionality into Black America as a community. We're already seeing the global influence on media behaviors today. So overall, you'll see that the US Black population spends over 81 hours a week with media. And one of those examples, again, is there's increased access to international news and entertainment from 16% just a couple of years ago to 18% last year. Another great example that I love is we saw 45 of the most listened to recordings last year were from or featured African artists. And so we've got a fun section on Afrobeats in the report. And then also tracking the use of subtitles to engage content that's in a different language. And so 41% of Black Gen Zers versus 36% of Gen Z overall said they're using subtitles to have a better content experience or consume in languages that they don't speak. So we'll dive into what I like to call America's key audience, because there really is no other community that's spending as much time with media as a part of their day and weekly behaviors. What's key for us to remember here is that content really is key to this culture. So that trading in, have you seen this show? Can you quote this movie line or this rap lyric? All of those things have been used to kind of build and influence the culture around us. But also, as we talk about that population complexity, it takes a lot of media to meet the different demands of folks who are showing up in the community. And so you'll see in this report an outline of how that shakes out. So across all kinds of different television usage, radio still playing a huge part in the weekly media behaviors, over 9.5 hours a week, internet on computer, but really a lot of video and app consumption across all of these devices get us to more than 81 hours a week, whereas the population overall is averaging about 69 hours. Why you'll hear us talk a lot about the television or video content is more than half of Black audience media time is actually with TV. And we think this is really important because, again, if this is where folks are spending the most of the bulk of the time, there are also some key opportunities to continue to meet demand for representation and improve on some of the things we heard back from respondents in our study. When I say America's key audience, I think it's important for us to think about Black America in this way, because there is some hesitation in our business to center these historically excluded experiences or voices or nuances for fear of isolating potentially other groups. And really what the data has shown, and we'll get into some more examples, is, when you center Black stories, there's an opportunity to bring others along, but also to, the trend set in this culture will influence most of the cultures around us. So as you might see in the headlines, there's a ton of attention to streaming television right now. But in Black America, there's still a demand to get sort of the best of both worlds. So both traditional television, live TV, cable channels, and all of that, in addition to all of the great new technologies that unlock content really around the world like never before. So I love this example because it shows us what are the tech setups or the technology setups that Black households are using to still engage with television. And yes, we've seen this change significantly over the last 5 years or so, but access to broadcast channels has actually sustained pretty well. You see a huge shift in cable access, that middle set of bars there. And really kind of trading that traditional cable package for access to broadband internet and all of the different options that kind of encaptures for a household. So again, if I'm a broadband only household, according to Nielsen's definition, then I only have that internet connection and a screen, and that's how I watch TV. And so these combinations, actually, when we looked at the number of households that still had sort of a virtual cable package, broadcast channels, and that internet access, Black households over-index for having that little bit of everything to make sure that we can still get the best of what TV and video content has to offer. A great example of this to me is, again, if you've been watching any TV or following any TV headlines over the last year, you may have seen that Suits was in the news a lot because I think it's been off the air maybe 5 or 6 years now. It was on USA. This is also Princess Meghan's former TV show, but it went on Netflix last year and it just dominated our streaming ratings. So like billions of minutes viewed every week. But what I thought was interesting as we talk about like people kind of going back in retro television or these library catalogs, right? When you look at Living Single, which I think turns 30 years old this year, over 7 billion minutes were viewed to this program by Black audiences in 2023. And that's 1 billion minutes more than were viewed to Suits by the same audience. And so the way that we get to the 7 billion is, again, the combination of this program on streaming and this program across multiple cable channels. So I love this example of showing like, again, this audience gets the best of both worlds to get to the content that they want. And sometimes it's a little bit different than what the main headline might be. Another example of this is really that diverse options drive engagement. So the more choice that I can get with low barriers to entry really resonate with this audience. And so another big headline is the growth of FAST networks or free ad-supported streaming. We love an acronym. This is quote unquote channels like Tubi, Pluto, or Roku. And combined across all of TV usage that we measure across all audiences, they make up about 3% of all TV usage. When we zone in on the Black audience, we're spending almost 4% of our TV time just with Tubi. And Tubi's strategy has been very poignant in trying to have a ton of options that can address various needs across Black audiences. And it's paying off in the time that they spend with television. And so in addition to our buying power and our population, the demand for representation is growing considerably as well. And as you might imagine, the way that media has behaved traditionally, there might be one character. There might be one character who's very similar to the other one character across all different kinds of programming, right? And really what we heard loud and clear from audiences was that that's not going to be sufficient for going forward. And so we wanted to dive into a little bit more about how that shakes out in the data. And so when we asked folks about how often they're feeling misrepresented, we really wanted to look at different segments within Black America to help tease this out when we talk about more nuance, more intersectionality, and getting away from those broad strokes. So we saw that some of the most misrepresented in their feeling, Black LGBTQ plus audiences, Afro-Latino viewers, Black men, Black women, Black people with disabilities, all more than 60% or more are saying, I often feel misrepresented when I'm consuming media. And keep in mind, nobody's consuming more media than this audience. So who better to kind of talk back to the industry and say, yep, saw it, and this did not resonate. And we have traditionally thought of engaging with content as a vote of approval. And that isn't necessarily the case. Just because we show up doesn't mean we're sold. And especially in today's media environment where audiences have the ability to talk back and to share experience, I can definitely go and watch an entire program and go and share my thoughts about it on social media, and they may not be all that great. And that goes for both content and for brands who are trying to engage this audience. So this for us was a really big call to action about, yes, this audience is consuming a ton of different content, but it's happening in places where you may not have considered before. It's happening in ways we may not have had access to before. And there are mechanisms to go and share both when we are pleased and when we are not. And so overall, that kind of shakes out to really 2 out of 3 Black viewers saying that there's not enough representation on TV. We also measure, in addition to just audience viewing and engagement, we also measure representation in lead recurring roles on screen. And so when we looked at that, there's more representation than ever of Black talent on screen. But that stat paired with this stat means that quantity and quality aren't always hand in hand. And so there might be more representation quantity than ever before, but what the audiences are really telling us is that there's a need for more context, more diverse stories, more diverse genres, and sort of breaking those tropes and stereotypes from years past. And so this is an interesting moment as we, again, I sit on the DEI team here at Nielsen. And so in our industry, there's some interesting trends happening around that acronym as well. And there's also some trends about pulling back some of these stories and some of this content. I think a lot of it has to do with, again, looking for that overnight success that maybe in previous stages of media, folks just kind of all showed up like the Super Bowl and then and went on to watch the next thing. But it can take time for audiences to get to a piece of content and to really engage with it. A piece of content also has to have the right support and investment in order to find its audience, right? So the marketing and promotions and how people get access to it. Is it paywalled or is it ad supported? All of these things matter in trying to get that that content that's been distributed with a great diverse story or narrative to the right audience. And again, sometimes we do ourselves a disservice because just because we have centered that Black story doesn't mean that that story isn't for all audiences, right? And so we could be missing out on some of those other great opportunities to take that story further when we don't have the marketing or the promotion resources to match. And so I thought this recent conversation with Issa Rae, who's busted down all kinds of doors and trends in recent years, and having some of her, I think her most recent program being discontinued, and her just like kind of sharing some of her frustration around like, do we really have the right support in the industry to continue to tell diverse Black stories? Because the audience is saying, yes, I want more of this. And the decision makers are kind of pulling back. And so it's an interesting tension right now. And I don't know what the solution is, but hopefully we find it soon because, again, our data has supported that audiences are really ready for representation that goes beyond the basics. When we look at our data set that measures how folks are represented and when, how often they're represented, it's a lot of the same themes. So it's urban, those cities and narratives that maybe have traditionally been put forward, moms of sons and tragedy and those kinds of things. And so many of the audiences in the segments that we talk to are saying, hey, I'm ready for more. I'm ready to see these different family tensions or different settings that haven't been there previously before. I thought this stat is also really powerful to me because in addition to being a source of entertainment, media and especially television are also sources of aspiration, and they can also be a source of education. And this showed up in our data very clearly when we asked folks like, well, why is watching this, inclusive content important to you? And 62% of our Black respondents said it was important as a way to learn about the historical struggles and experiences of their own identity group. And only 43% of respondents overall felt that way. I thought this was really interesting for this community because, again, if we think about how to leverage video content in connecting with potential visitors or patrons of museums or the exhibits that you're building, there is something about that connection to video and inclusive content that really people are seeking out to fill in the blanks they may not be getting in the classroom. And I also wanted to take a minute to dive deeper into when we say taking representation further, what does that really mean? What does that look like? And so we've got a little bit more information here about the Black LGBTQ plus segment. On the left-hand side is some of that representation data that I mentioned. So when we look at Black queer folks who have lead recurring roles on some of the most watched programs on television. In 2019, that was about 1.8% of lead recurring roles across TV. That's down slightly last year to just 1.5%. So I've got less than 2% of the lead recurring roles, even though population estimates say Black LGBTQ folks make about 6.6% of the population. It's not hard to see how we get to that 7 out of 10 of folks in this community feel misrepresented, because that 1.5% is having to do a lot of work. And chances are, and again, what we measure is the talent who is cast in a role. So it might be just somebody who lives that experience, but they're playing a character that may not have that experience. So that's important to keep in mind here. But again, just having that access to folks, kind of being front and center, it matters and it's important. And so we'll continue to measure that and see, because again, there is something to be said for just the limited amount of quantity that's there, and it makes getting that quality a little bit more challenging. Another way that we look for this is really under the banner of the search to feel seen, right? To feel seen and to feel heard. But when it comes to video content, again, we looked at Black queer women. 2 out of 3 agreed that content choice is really an essential part and a benefit of streaming. So as we see some of the folks across the industry pulling back their libraries or canceling programming, this is really, especially for historically excluded audiences, this is a primary benefit of having access to a streaming platform. It's my window to this vast amount of content and choice that is not always there in a traditional lineup of programming. And so the benefit is now that I can, plug in the internet and take me around to all these different experiences, whether it be a documentary of something I didn't know in the community, like we saw a couple slides ago, kind of filling in the education piece, or maybe it's something that's not in the US. And I can import some of that experience, especially from a Black queer experience, through these streaming subscriptions or access that I maybe have not had in years prior, or through traditional TV means. So this I thought was really important. Of course, this outpaced LGBTQ women overall and women overall, with the demand for having this choice being a key reason why folks turn to streaming. And then from the brand side, we talked a lot about content so far, but from the brand side, there are also implications here too. Everybody is also talking about social media and getting an influencer to, help sell your product. And so one of the studies we did a couple of years ago looked at, what's the building blocks for reaching the LGBTQ plus community as an advertiser. And if you are going to partner with a creator or an influencer to endorse a product, the upside is this piece on the right, where you see almost 3 times more likely to buy a product that's endorsed by an influencer. But on the left, it's saying, it's showing you that for the Black LGBTQ plus community, that authenticity really is the name of the game. That these consumers agreed that commitment to the community and social responsibility were the most relevant aspects that brands should look for when you are partnering with an influencer to endorse products in their community. And so we saw some additional big headlines last year with missteps in the Bev Al sector, where maybe they didn't have the right match of influencer to product, but the authenticity of that match and how they will really connect with the consumer that you want to reach is really very important. And it may be different for the different segments of the LGBTQ plus community that you're trying to connect with. And so next, I thought we'd go through a little bit more about the role of media and culture. And again, we've spoken a lot about streaming just because it is so popular and has grown so much. In addition to that 55% of time with television, Black audiences also spending, I think it's 17 and a half hours just with connected TV. So internet-enabled television is a huge part of the TV lineup. And how that shakes out is, again, over 73% of Black audiences have 3 or more streaming services. And so there's this really complex menu of, okay, I need these couple programs over here. I'm going to dabble in this over here. Maybe I'm sharing a login over there to make sure that I can get to the lineup that I want to get to. And where many audiences have told us, I am overwhelmed by the amount of choice that's out there right now in TV. our Black respondents really told us that they're embracing it. They're not overwhelmed by the amount of choice that exists. They're actually looking forward to it. It's an enhancement to how they interact with media. Perfect example for this, again, in the Search to Fill scene, when we look at the top 5 most streamed programs for Black men, it was across 4 different streaming services. So just to get in the top 5, I needed Netflix, Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, Peacock, and then I think it was another Netflix. And so if that's not, that was just a great example to me of just the amount of stuff it takes to get to programs where, man, I really love that character. I really love that story. I really want to see this fantastical experience. And they might all be in different places. Another great call out we thought was, again, how media perceptions are changing along with this media engagement and along with the population shifts. So it's an election year. And not just in the US, but I think it's like over 2 billion people globally are going to be voting in some fashion this year. And so it was important for us to really call out some shifts that are happening when it comes to trusted sources. There's not a lot of distrust when it comes to local TV news, but the bulk of those folks who said, hey, I don't really view local TV news as a reliable source, they were Black millennials. Black millennials were twice as likely to trust information that they got on social media. And they named social media, YouTube, and cable TV as their top news sources. But meanwhile, again, a third of the Black millennials make up about a third of the folks who are saying local TV isn't where I'm getting my news from, or where I see as reliable. And so this tension for me is important because, again, in the age of generative AI and deep fakes and maybe some erosion of local journalism, how are we going to ensure that the practices and the standards that make something trustworthy are translated to the next generation of audiences and news consumers and electorate? And I think that is a conversation that we should be having a little bit louder and with some different generations or different folks in the room, because it is showing up in the data that overall there's a sense that there's something that's not there that really connects. And I think Pew Research a couple of months ago released some research that that also underscored like a lack of trust in how folks, or displeasure in how folks are, Black folks are represented in the news. And so I think that in addition is fueling this hesitancy to really embrace that as a source. But if you think about sort of peak Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, this age group has also seen, justice brought forward because of something on social media, exposure to maybe the Arab Spring or things that were happening around the world because of social media. And so at its best, it was broadening horizons and giving direct access to journalists. But there's been so much shift just in the last 18 months to 2 years that I think it's a really good time, especially in this voting year, to rethink and also to continue to educate. Speaking of social, again, the power of Black creators, I think, really also illustrates just how powerful centering Black stories and voices the right way can be to bring other folks along. One of the questions that we asked here is, it's important for me to follow Black creators and influencers on social media. With half of I think it was 51% of our white Gen Z respondents said, yes, this is important to me to follow a Black creator. So again, if you're thinking about your audience of the future, it's not a turnoff to center historically excluded perspectives and voices and experiences. It's kind of mandatory because, again, when you think about the cultural cachet, it's happening a lot of times in this community. But not only is this important to Black folks in Black America, in this study, we talked to Black audiences in 5 different countries. And so in every country we went to, it was a priority to connect with Black creators and influencers. What's also important for us to call out is, in some prior research we did last year, we also found that this set of creators often delivers a higher media value for the brands that they endorse and interact with. So that means we can calculate what would it cost a brand to reach that quality of an audience that a creator has in their social media following. And again, in the lifestyle category, 10 and a half times higher than non-Black creators. And we saw that outperformance across multiple metrics in multiple different categories. Going back to, again, the power of this influence for this audience, again, when we look at maybe the 18 to 34-year-old population, it's only about a quarter of the total US population, but they're more than twice as likely to go online and use social media to talk about a brand experience. So when you look at where influences are coming from, where that talkback is coming from, this is definitely an audience, and again, almost $2 trillion, where you really just cannot afford to miss. And so we feel it's in our clients' best interest to embrace this complexity with more nuance, with deeper understanding, and with the right authentic representation at every stage of media development to ensure that you're matching basically the energy of what Black America and beyond is giving. I'm just going to check my time really quick. Okay. And so again, when we talk about the culture, the media really is a way to connect. And this Black influence, it extends beyond borders. Again, we talked about, asked respondents, do you follow Black creators based outside of the US? And the answer was a resounding yes. For African Americans, was over 48%. But Black first generation Americans, more than half of them told us, I'm following Black influencers based in a different country. I thought that was really important because, again, it shows me that use of media to connect back to maybe a cultural experience that I don't know firsthand because I was born here. But my parents and aunties and uncles all have that memory of being there. And so through this social media connection, I can also start to curate that for myself. And then about 45% of Black and foreign born. So it was really interesting to see. Again, this is why diving into these segments of the population can really show some beautiful trends in the different segments that exist across our population. And then again, just underscoring the global demand that exists for as folks are everybody's looking for ways to cost cut and save money. Telling less diverse stories is not necessarily the way to do it because it's not just something that is in high demand in the US, but again, in multiple markets around the world. We asked, again, wish I saw more representation of my identity group, 47% in Black America, but nearly half of Black audiences in South Africa that we spoke to felt the same way. And then again, the feeling of misrepresentation in the media that folks do have access to only got higher as we went around the world. 61% of Black Brazilians, 75% of Nigerians, and on and on. So this opportunity to tell better stories, to be more nuanced and intersectional, more inclusive, there's definitely demand ready to meet it. We talked in the beginning about the population influence that Africa will have on our population. And just to lay out a couple of those trends. So already the African-born US population has grown about tripled in the last 2 decades. And so now, African-born folks in America is about on par with the Caribbean population that's been super strong here for decades. Also already in today's population, about 1 in 5 Black Americans are either an immigrant themselves or is a child of an immigrant. That's already today. A third of Black immigrants will account for the population growth through 2060. And what's really important, I think, for me to keep in mind when we talk about the population of Africa, it's the youngest one on the planet. So 7 out of 10 Africans are under the age of 30 today. That means, again, when we talk about the complexity, we talk about your future consumer, your future audience member. This is a really young population that's coming in with strong cultural background and experiences, but open to kind of rebuilding and informing their American experience, and media is going to play an essential role in that. One great example that we put in the report of just the influence that's already happening today is the growth and popularity of Afrobeats around the world. So this genre sort of born in Nigeria for the bulk of the artists that are traveling around the world. It's gone in, we looked at the different countries where both the number of artists and the number of songs, just kind of give a lay of the land. And again, it was over 45 artists from Africa, from the continent, charting in the US in over 30 different productions. And you'll see, of course, South Africa having thousands of songs as well. But again, we're going to continue to track that growth and see the global influence that there's this unique relationship now that through media, it's not just Black America exporting our experience around the world. Take, for example, hip hop and now its global popularity. Media now allows us to import and curate a global Black experience. So this was interesting. Maybe over the holidays, some of you remember seeing the viral interview with Taraji P. Henson talking about pay equity in Hollywood and the pay disparities in Hollywood for Black women. But how she started that monologue was really about, the frustrations of saying, they keep telling me that we don't translate overseas. But if you look at K-pop, and the trends and the style and the arrangements, that is Black 90s R&B. Again, if you look at hip hop, our data shows over 100 countries have at least one hip hop artist today. So in 50 years, it's grown globally. And again, it shows up in the results. So if you take a production like The Woman King, where again, the headlines were very surprised that this film did so well at the box office. It cost about, I think it had a $50 million budget and grossed over 93 million worldwide. And so again, the underestimating of how Black stories or how Black culture influences others, you do so at your peril. And so when done well, when done with the right teams in place, this can really have powerful impact. Yes, for the audience that is demanding it most with Black folks, but for all the other audiences that follow our lead. And this is another great example from the study of just how subtitles are also being leveraged to engage with more content, either to follow along better or just to engage in languages that I don't speak. And so again, if you think about the audience of the future, with your Gen Z population, over half of the Black Gen Z respondents in our study said they're using subtitles to better understand programming. We did have a small population that was saying, yes, I use subtitles because I'm hearing impaired. But that, by and large, was not the most popular source of using this technology. It really was to have a better and more diverse content experience, which we thought was pretty cool. And so a few lessons for brands as I wrap up here. It's about rethinking what's relevant to your audience and how to define inclusion, what that really looks like for this diverse audience. So one of the things that we wanted to tease out was the openness to try new brands, even if it's different from what like my parents or my family recommend, because that word of mouth endorsement and sort of that traditional endorsement has been so important in the community for so long. It was important for us to ask about that. And yes, it still definitely matters, but folks are also open to these new brands. And what's going to make me break my tradition of what my mama recommended to me? It's going to be how you move as a brand, how you give back. What are your practices? Does it work for me and my lifestyle? All of those elements of really understanding how you want to reach that consumer in particular and that particular segment are really important to continue to buy in with the Black consumer. When we talked about the relevance of certain kinds of ads, it was interesting that audio, both podcast and radio, had some of the highest scores globally of having most relevant advertising for Black audiences. And so there's a lot of room for improvement in video content where folks are spending a lot of time. Adam, are we doing a time check?
Let's do it. Let's go for questions. What do you think?
Awesome. Perfect. So yeah, there's a lot more goodies in that report, but we can definitely open it up to questions.
Great. Please get your questions in. Thank you so much. Let's jump in. I wonder if you can share a little bit about how and what are the ways that Black consumers are actually vetting these organizations, talking about brand a little bit more while the questions come in.
Vetting organizations like brands that they want to do business with.
Yeah. So whether how they're doing that to figure out, are these real organizations that they like and trust, that are worthwhile to spend their time, money, share, those things.
Yeah. So it's one of the ways actually is about, we talk about the power of black owned businesses and partnerships. And so one of the key areas that we looked at in prior research was 56% of Black audiences or consumers buy from brands that they feel give back to their community. And a key way that folks feel like you give back now is, are you partnering with Black owned or minority owned businesses to bring those dollars back into our communities to help build Black wealth and sustain that $2 trillion of buying power? Again, it's about, are you just targeting me, or do you really see our value?
Mm-hmm.
And I think consumers are increasingly more savvy of when folks are doing the work along every stage of the process, or if they are just kind of going after the cash grab. So I do think those Black owned partnerships are key for a lot of brands. Again, in the report saying, hey, I'm willing to drive further if you've got shelf space dedicated to Black owned brands. I'll stay in the store a little bit longer. I'll drive further. Those things are really important to not only do more business, but to help, like you said, build that trust with the community.
Yeah. So it's also about then really about storytelling and communicating that you're working with these partners and these local businesses. Great. So we have a question from Amber. Thank you so much for your question, Amber. Please get them into the chat. She writes, I'm interested to know if the research found on which social media platforms are the most visited and trusted for Black audiences.
We don't talk about it in this report, but in our prior report, Amplifying Black Voices, we do. And so I think it was for the top 5, Black audiences were basically spending more time than audiences overall. We didn't ask specifically about trust of particular platforms in this report, but the big guesses you could imagine is Twitter, actually, for this community, or X, still has a large part of time. TikTok is humongous. That cannot be understated. But we didn't ask specifically about trust. I will drop the link to our prior report. We talk a little bit more about the different types of social media that are out there. Or they're being used. Yeah.
That's great. And I should have started this with the first question. I can imagine that many who are attending this call and those who will watch the recording in the future will say, this is super great information, extremely well presented. How do we use this at a museum, at one of the branches of the Smithsonian? How do we translate this? So what advice would you have for folks looking at this data who might want to share in an upcoming meeting? How would you tell them to use this when it's slightly tangential to the work that they do?
Great question. I think that the best way to try to leverage or translate this data is, one, talking about how you want to bring in visitors to the work that you're doing. Is there a new, different, better way for us to be communicating to offices? If we've always put the same print ad in the same magazine, maybe that's not the best way to reach our museum visitor of the future, or our patron of the future, or our donor of the future. Building the case on value and building the brand of value with a new generation of audience might mean some different things. Maybe it's a podcast to really to reach those folks who are tuning in and already think that that's the most relevant advertising space to promote a new exhibit or a new venture. So I think how this informs both your promotion strategy to get folks to come in, but also to help spread the word about all the fantastic work and resources that are available across the Smithsonian system. Those are two immediate takeaways, I would say.
Right.
And then what you're saying yes to actually build, to take up space in your exhibits. Again, those historically excluded voices and stories are essential, and people are really, really searching for them from trusted sources. So I think you have a really powerful role to play in again, filling in those blanks.
Yeah, that's great. I love the data on 50% about subtitles. I'm definitely going to share that. That's some really good information. But I want to go back to a quote you said, showing up doesn't mean being sold. I think that's really interesting. So we might be able to bring people in real life to a physical exhibition or a program or online, but there's work to be done. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that continued story about what we have to do to really turn that showing up into really being sold.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the other question too of like how are brands really winning with that new consumer who might be open? So I would say I think that this savvy audience wants to know, okay, so you've got this new exhibit about the Black experience. Like, how many people that worked on building that exhibit were Black? Did you talk to people who lived the experience? Like, they want to know that there was authenticity at every stage. That applies to every demographic that you are telling stories about. But especially for this group, I think audiences increasingly kind of want to kick the tires on stuff to see if it really holds up or if there is a different lens that historically been in control that is still trying to control a narrative. I was listening to a really great podcast on the media earlier this week, and it was actually a subject about Russian propaganda in telling their history and stories. But the historian actually spoke about the power of the African American Smithsonian as an example of when you are really trying to deprogram a society about a historical narrative, you have to pull in narratives that have been left out. And so he mentioned the Smithsonian as one of his favorite examples of doing that work that they need to do in their own history in Russia. Because it's been very much focused on telling, the government's narrative. And so I think that's a great example of the work that you're doing, continuing to be so powerful, not just here, but around the world. So who'd have thought that there's a Russian historian in exile who's really just singing your praises. So kudos.
Well, there's folks on this call certainly that I'm sure appreciate the praise. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about who's watching or who's showing up. We've had some great presentations on the Latinx, Hispanic audiences, and one of the things that is shared is that these are intergenerational audiences. So with the streaming, with the television, with the multiple channels, with showing up the real programs, is this intergenerational? What can we learn from the data that can help us be more informed in our practice?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the interesting things you'll see in the report is there's really nobody watching more TV than Black elders. So the Black audience 65 and plus are just tuning into that traditional television. So both broadcast and cable. Definitely some streaming access these days, but they are really sort of leaving the TV on as that companion. And while you might have more intergenerational, depending on the type of the segment that you're going in or the community that you're going in. I lost it, earbud. Hold on. We definitely are seeing lots of families. So the millennial parents and kids. So where there may not be the same level of like multi-generational households, what we do see is the same level of voracious media engagement across generations, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's really interesting, which I think dovetails into something I would love for you to share a little bit more about, which is the global influence on the American population of Black and African Americans, which is so truly international. So content is coming in, not historically it was just going out. So how is that shaping a kind of additional persuasion of buying power and attendance, which you talked about, but also then what's interesting is we're not seeing that in terms of representation in the media. So you have this kind of interesting thing where you can show the music, listen to Fela Kuti over the weekends. I love the reference, but now what we're seeing is we're not getting some of those other things maybe on TV or streaming, yet we have the data. So what's going on here?
Yeah, I think the import of Black experiences was really interesting to see in the data. So you have companies like Netflix that have made very strategic investment in Nollywood, for example, so Nigerian television and movies. And so we highlight a couple of those programs in the report that had hundreds of millions of minutes viewed in their premiere period on the app. And so we have folks who, maybe have a cultural historical connection to that country tuning in, of course, but then just Black folks who are looking for, oh, what's this? And tuning in. And it's so that sort of investment paying off both in the TV space. And then you see the popularity of, using the Afrobeat genre as an example, seeing that take off. So I think what we're seeing is, especially as I'm watching more and more of the same in traditional content, I can go beyond borders and find maybe a Black UK experience and voice and slang and culture that I wasn't exposed to before. or see something out of Nigeria that I wasn't exposed to before, something out of Brazil that I
Mm.
wasn't exposed to before, and learning about, oh my gosh, that's the largest Black population outside of the African continent, which I didn't know until I was very much too old to know that. And so again, leveraging access to media to diversify your own Black experience, and again, filling in those blanks when what you may have traditionally had access to falls short. I think that's when you see people continue to import content and experiences.
Yeah, so they're really dictating their stream,
Yep.
their kind of what they're looking at. I love this question from Leslie Walker. That asks, "What does your research reveal about the intersections of Blackness, especially queerness?" It's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that there should be more. I think, and let me see if I can just jump back to that slide really quick. Hold, please. Especially, it was very stark to see the number of folks who felt misrepresented in the community. I want to go back to that first. So 7 out of 10 who identify as Black and queer feeling misrepresented often in the data. And so then cut to, what does that look like with actual on-screen lead roles in representation? There's not a lot. And so I think there's still, for those who are green lighting or giving notes about content, there is still a lot of hesitancy around how those folks might show up. GLAAD does a great report, Where We Are on TV. And so they actually cover all of the queer characters that might show up on screen, which is a little bit different than just Black talent. But what our data shows is Black talent is being cast in these in lead recurring roles less than they were 4 or 5 years ago. And we also know that there is, again, there's still that trope and stereotype space that we need to continue to break out of, to tell, the narratives, not just of, yes, historical accuracy or, news goings on, but where's the joy, the love story, and all of those aspirational things as well that are important to go through. And so I think that there's more work to be done, and making sure that you have the right lived experience and expertise in those writers' rooms, in those decision-making chairs, as well as on screen playing the part is going to continue to be important.
Yeah, and I can imagine this equally true, especially true for able and disabled-bodied representation. And Leslie, please let us know if you have an additional follow-up to that kind of that question, because it is really interesting and it gets to so much of what we're talking about here. And I think if you could go back to talk a little bit more, maybe about the 62%. That really of the audience is really getting learning. This is where they're going to learn and expanding their knowledge, and they're doing it through entertainment, which is fascinating and maybe fascinating. So help us as educational institutions. How do we better leverage this information, knowing that audiences are going here to learn? They might not be coming to us. So how do we help? How do we help inform, influence, and participate in this to encourage this number and really take advantage of it?
This really caught my eye, because if you think about changes in curriculum, changes in access to books, very simple, this actually happened, children's books, or retelling of not just a history, but the takeaways and implications of a history. I think that this really matters when you think about how folks are going to engage with Smithsonian content when they're not at the Smithsonian. And so that is sort of the strategy that I think is important for you all to continue to think through, is if we have an audience that's saying, I really want to engage in media for this purpose, when I'm looking for something to watch or somebody to follow potentially, or a podcast to tune into, how else can I engage with the Smithsonian when I'm not at the Smithsonian?
Yeah.
You can fill a really huge gap here, thinking about some of the ways folks are interacting with media across the board.
Great. One of the questions I'm really wondering about, since we are really talking about such a diverse audience whose backgrounds are so fascinating, what are the languages that folks should be thinking about, or is it covered just by the subtitles? And I think the answer is going to be no, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about language and what's important here, and what should we what should we think about?
Yeah, that is a great question, because again, I think what is Africa, like 51 countries? I'm going to get it wrong, but and within each of those countries, different dialects, different tribes that have their own. There's language can play such a huge part in
plus
the next
Spanish
stage of growth. Spanish could play a huge part. Portuguese,
Mm.
Haitian Creole. And so I think especially when it comes, when I gave this example again for advertisers of language doesn't have to be like an isolating factor. When the emotion is universal, when the story is like universal and told well, language is just an added oomph for those that speak it. But when it's done in the right way, it doesn't isolate those who can still kind of tell what's going on.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to folks who can leverage that language other than English to tell a rich story. Audiences are not turned off by that necessarily, as long as it's done in the right way. And so one, caption everything that you're doing in video content. Every piece of content is going to live everywhere if you want young folks to engage, or if you want parents who are like doom scrolling at night to engage and viewing on silent. But I do
wouldn't
think
know
that
about
language,
that, would you?
yeah, had no clue what that is. But I think language is a really big opportunity to immerse an audience, to connect them into a story. And I don't think we should think about it as it has to be in English. Let's continue to look at where that growth is coming from and how we can just leverage that as a way to tell a really immersive story.
Something that this might just be me for those on the call, but I'm dying to ask Charlene. I think a lot about evaluation and research and measuring. What are some of the kinds of questions that we should be thinking about from a museum perspective, be it exhibitions, be it programs, be it online activity, to really start to understand not just that people are coming to us, but that we're having some kind of an impact. Obviously, this is different from what you all do at Nielsen, but is there some advice, Charlene's top 2-3 questions that you would think that we should consider or just ponder? Does that make sense?
In your own, I lost my slideshow, but in your own surveys,
yeah.
This off now. I think that it is important to continue to ask the questions that let you get to the nuance of a population. So again, this was our first time really playing around with like sort of the where were you born, where were your parents born set of questions. But it allowed us to get these really rich profiles that we think that the industry needs to be considering more. So ask it in the right, the thoughtful way. This is not like, we're not immigration. We're not, trying to send people away or whatever. What we are trying to understand is there a different experience or perception or interpretation to what we're building based on the cultural experience that you brought, to what we built? And so I do think there is like, everybody who is Black in America hasn't gone through US Black history. Doesn't maybe have the perception of not just, this experience of our enslaved ancestors, but then Jim Crow laws and redlining and all those other elements that lead to how we got to now. And so if, what's the baseline of the audience that we're speaking to, both for who's here, but maybe coming out of from out of the country. I think those kinds of questions that help you build a more nuanced profile are going to continue to be critical, because again, broad stroke monolith perception of Black or defining as urban will be insufficient, is already insufficient. Right. So the more questions you can ask to kind of delve deeper, I think will serve you well.
That's great. My last question. So let me say first, thank you very much. This has been quite an honor. I can't wait for folks to have a copy of this, which will come out soon. And I hope to see everyone at the next talk, which I put in the chat. I wonder if you can share in your kind of final comments about just the power of influence. I can't remember the stat you said, but this is an audience that not only are they going to participate and they're going to watch, but they're going to comment and they're going to share. What does that mean, both positive and negative, in terms of the work that we do and the content we do, and just in terms of their influence? We understand the financial, but their influence.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that thinking about and approaching how you will serve Black audiences as a partner to the work. Like, if we can really get this right here, we're going to get talked about in the best way. We're going to get the influence of all these folks who are following their lead. So thinking about how to serve the audience, yes, and then how to be in partnership with them, how to hear and listen to what it is they're saying they need or want. Who are the right constituents to help inform that strategy? Is it educators? Is it, journalists? Is it a combination therein? How else can you continue to fill in the blanks of that strategy to make sure that the Black audience and Black America in particular are your partners in success going forward about how you tell our own stories, and what they want to hear about other stories, right? So I do think that, considering how to bring in more of those voices, especially if there's a segment of the population you haven't spoken to before, get in there and go do it.
That's great. Well, what a way to end this program. Thank you so much for joining us. This is great work. Charlene has kindly shared the link. I'll put it online for everyone later. And I hope to see you all soon. And please do visit Nielsen online to see this information. Charlene, thanks again. And everyone have a great day and the rest of your week. Thank you so much. See you all at the next talk.
Thanks for having me.